In 1762, France was facing defeat by the British in the Seven Years' War, but rather than allow the Louisiana territories to be taken by the British, the French secretly ceded the land to the Spanish in the Treaty of Fontainebleau. But by 1800, Napoleon was in power, and he was in a position to recover the land from Spain, negotiating in secret the Third Treaty of Saint Defonso. The French foreign minister at the time, Charles Maurice de Talleyrand, reportedly argued during the negotiations, quote, "The power of America is bounded by the limit which it may suit the interests and tranquility of France and Spain to assign here. The French Republic will be the walls of brass forever impenetrable to the combined efforts of England and America." Napoleon reportedly had bold ambitions to the Americas, intending to recapture Haiti and set up a military stronghold which would eventually be a stepping stone toward expansion up the Mississippi Valley. But the Haitian expedition was a disaster. More than 40,000 men were lost fighting the Haitian resistance and yellow fever, including his brother-in-law, General Charles Leclerc. On hearing of Leclerc's death and the failure of the expedition, Napoleon is reported to have said, "Damn sugar, damn coffee, damn colonies," in January of 1803. By April of 1803, he had decided to sell the territory to fund his wars in Europe, rather than keep trying to recover what had been lost. He reportedly said to his ministers ahead of the negotiations, quote, "I know the full value of Louisiana, and I have been desirous of repairing the fault of the French negotiator who abandoned it in 1763. A few lines of a treaty have restored it to me, and I have scarcely recovered it when I must expect to lose it." Following the sale of Louisiana to the United States, he reportedly said, quote, "The accession of territory affirms forever the power of the United States, and I have just given England a maritime rival that sooner or later will humble their pride." The French ambassador to the United States said of the sale, quote, "The decision was not dictated by a desire to sell, but by the impossibility of keeping." The sale and transfer of the land was made even more complicated by the fact that France had reacquired much of the land from Spain in 1800 as part of a secret agreement, meaning Spain was still administering much of the land, and most people didn't know they were French. This led to a series of ceremonies taking place throughout the region, as the transfer had to first go from Spain to France before France could formally transfer the area to the United States. The full transfer took place in early March of 1804. The land south of the 33rd parallel became the territory of Orleans, and in several places, celebration days became known as Three Flags Days. The territory of Orleans was not formally certified until October 1st, 1804. On July 4th, 1805, the remaining area formally became the territory of Louisiana, with the original capital being St. Louis. Following the Revolutionary War, for different reasons, all of the 13 colonies had at least some kind of restrictions against international slave importation at one point or another, but they were inconsistently implemented and enforced. As part of the Constitutional Compromise, Congress was forbidden from formally banning the practice until 1808. But when 1808 came, Congress made the importation of slaves a federal offense. This restriction was just as much about economics as morals, as given by this point the slave population of the South was so large they had become net exporters of slaves, meaning stopping additional importation was a kind of protectionism. It was also believed that imported slaves were more difficult to prevent from engaging in slave uprisings, particularly after what had taken place in Haiti. But in Louisiana territories, this was a significant change. Many French slavers had fled Haiti during the Revolution, bringing slaves with them to attempt to set up similar plantations in Louisiana. This meant a large part of the population was well aware of what had happened in Haiti, and the conditions were not unsimilar to the Haitian uprising. By 1810, some accounts indicate that the enslaved and free blacks combined greatly outnumbered the whites in the area around New Orleans, and more than half of those who were enslaved were born outside of the area, often having been brought directly from Africa. In addition to enslaved blacks, a relatively large free black population was emerging in the area, many of them coming from Haiti by way of Cuba, and some even owning slaves, as it had been permitted by the French in Haiti. On January 8, 1811, a slave uprising took place roughly 30 miles upstream from New Orleans. Armed primarily with farm implements used as weapons, they marched toward New Orleans, reportedly singing variations of French Revolution songs, gathering slaves from various plantations as they went. But farm tools aren't guns. When the local militia supported by members of the Army and Navy arrived in the early morning of January 10th, the estimated 200 participants in the uprising were attacked, with around 40 being killed immediately. One of the ringleaders of the uprising was captured and brutally executed without a trial. According to naval officer Samuel Hambleton, he was, quote, "then shot in one thigh, then the other, until they were both broken, then shot in the body, and before he had expired, was put into a bundle of straw and roasted." After the trials that followed, the heads of the executed slaves were placed on pikes, reportedly having nearly 100 slaves displayed on a levee, which ran between the Palace to Arms, all along River Road. Hamilton said of this, quote, "They were brung up here for the sake of their heads, which decorate our levee, all the way up the coast. I am told they look like crows sitting on long poles." On April 12, 1812, Louisiana became a state, despite its western border with Spanish Texas still being disputed. By 1840, New Orleans was the third largest city in the country and the home to the largest slave market in the United States. It was also home to one of the largest free black populations in the country, with the census taken just before the Civil War indicating over 18,000 free blacks living in the state. But this was contrasted by the over 330,000 slaves also living in Louisiana, which made up nearly 47% of the total population. When Abraham Lincoln was elected, Louisiana Governor Thomas Overton Moore stated, quote, "I do not think it comports with the honor and self-respect of Louisiana as a slaveholding state to live under the government of a black Republican president." He also said, quote, "So bitterly is this hostility felt toward slavery, which these 15 states regard as a great social and political blessing, that it exhibits itself in legislation for the avowed purpose of destroying the rights of slaveholders guaranteed by the Constitution and protected by acts of Congress." In the North, a widespread sympathy with felons has deepened the distrust in the permanent federal government and awakened sentiments favorable to a separation of states. He ordered the Louisiana militia to occupy various federal fortifications and armories around New Orleans and Baton Rouge. In March of 1861, Louisiana State Commissioner George Williamson stated at the Texas Secession Convention, quote, "With the social balance wheel of slavery to regulate its machinery, we may finally indulge in the hope that our Southern government will be perpetual. Louisiana looks to the formation of a Southern Confederacy to preserve the blessings of African slavery." New Orleans was one of the most important targets for the Union, being the largest city in the South and a crucial port. By January of 1862, the blockade of New Orleans had begun. By April, the forts, particularly New Orleans, were under bombardment. On April 25th, the city surrendered. On May 1st, 1862, Major General Benjamin Butler occupied the city. Before the war, Butler had spoken out against the abolition of slavery and had run for the governor of Massachusetts on a pro-slavery, pro-tariff platform, losing to incumbent Republican Governor Nathaniel Banks. But once it was clear war was inevitable, Butler was staunchly pro-Union, reportedly saying, quote, "I was always a friend of Southern rights, but an enemy of Southern wrongs." Before coming to New Orleans, he had served in Maryland early in the war, restoring rail and securing service between Annapolis and Washington. While there, he earned a reputation for being willing to use heavy-handed tactics to restore and maintain order. He reportedly threatened the Maryland legislatures with arrest if they should appear and vote for secession, and he seized the seal of Maryland, stating, "without which no legislation could become law." When sent to Virginia, Butler initiated a policy that allowed the freeing of captured slaves, arguing he need not enforce the fugitive slave law as, quote, "I am under no constitutional obligation to a foreign country, which Virginia now claims to be." Describing his arrival in New Orleans, Butler said, quote, "We were only 2,500 men in a city of 150,000 inhabitants, all hostile, bitter, defiant, explosive, standing literally in a magazine, a spark only needed for destruction." As was expected, many residents of New Orleans protested the occupation, including some women who had spit on Union soldiers. Some even went so far as emptying chamber pots onto Union soldiers as they walked in the streets below them. In response, Butler issued the following order, quote, "As the officers and soldiers of the United States have been subjected to repeated insults from the women, calling themselves ladies of New Orleans, in return for the most scrupulous non-interference and courtesy on our part, it is ordered that hereafter, when any female shall by word, gesture, or movement insult or show contempt for any officer or soldier of the United States, she shall be regarded and held liable to be treated as women of the town plying their avocation." Butler required residents to take an oath of allegiance to the Union and prohibited public prayer for the Confederacy, even going so far as to close some churches which refused to pray for President Lincoln. A man by the name of William Mumford was arrested by Butler's men after, according to Butler, quote, "a party headed by Mumford had torn down the flag, dragged it through the streets and spit on it, and trampled on it until it was torn to pieces. It was then distributed among the rabble, and each one thought it was a high honor to get a piece of it and wear it." Mumford was sentenced to execution. Most expected Butler to pardon him, but Butler refused, promising to care for his family, but refusing to commute his sentence. Butler soon became a hated figure throughout the South. He was given the nickname Spoons after stories circulated of his confiscation of silver spoons from a woman attempting to cross Union lines. Modern historians generally credit him for breaking up organized crime rings in the city and setting up public schools in aid for the poor. Also, his programs for removing garbage and improving sanitation dramatically reduced the amount of deaths from yellow fever in the city. But his negative reputation spread throughout the South to the point that reportedly years after the Civil War, chamber pots with his face on them were used on steamboats in the lower Mississippi. Union Admiral David Farragut, who had led the forces which initially captured the city, said of Butler, quote, "They may say what they please about General Butler, but he was the right man in the right place in New Orleans." In December of 1862, Butler was replaced by Nathaniel Banks, who freed a number of civilians Butler had detained and reopened churches Butler had closed. When Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in January 1st of 1863, former slaves began arriving in New Orleans, hearing of the announcement. Banks made a deal with plantation owners for a work program where in exchange for 10-hour workdays, former slaves could expect to receive food, shelter, and medical care, along with either $3 a month or 5% of the proceeds from the sale of the crop. At the height of the program, estimates were 50,000 former slaves participating in this program across 1,500 plantations and farms. In August of 1863, while the war continued, Lincoln ordered Banks to oversee the creation of a new state constitution. By February of 1864, Banks had been able to hold limited elections, electing a German immigrant by the name of Michael Hahn to be governor of Louisiana, running as a moderate for the Free State Party. Following the election, Banks wrote to Lincoln that Louisiana would, quote, "become in 2 years, under a wise and strong government, one of the most loyal and prosperous states the world has ever seen." Lincoln wrote to Hahn congratulating him, and included in the letter a question as to, quote, "whether some of the colored people may not be let in, as, for instance, the very intelligent, and especially those who fought gallantly in our ranks." But he closed the letter saying, "But this is only a suggestion, to you alone." A constitutional convention was held between April and July of 1864. Only 19 parishes sent delegates, as this was all the Union controlled at the time. One of the first orders of business was that the Constitution should include emancipation. Judge Edward Durrell, who chaired the convention, reportedly said to the few who opposed the inclusion, quote, "If you think slavery exists, go out in the streets and see if you can get your slave to obey you." The inclusion of abolition passed by a vote of 73 to 13, with no compensation included. The Constitution included public education, but did not grant black suffrage, leaving that for the state legislature to decide. The failure to include suffrage outraged blacks in Louisiana and led many in Congress to lead a filibuster to prevent delegates from Louisiana from being seated in Congress as part of the compromise agreements. Despite not including black voting rights, Lincoln seemed to view the Louisiana Constitution as an example of a path forward for the rest of the South to be able to rejoin the Union. On April 11, 1865, just a few days after Lee surrendered at Appomattox, Lincoln gave a speech that spoke at length about the new Constitution in Louisiana and his views on voting rights for former slaves. Lincoln said, quote, "It is also unsatisfactory to some that the elective franchise is not given to the colored man. I would myself prefer that it was now conferred on the very intelligent and on those who serve our cause as soldiers. Still, the question is not whether the Louisiana government as it stands is quite all that is desirable. The question is, will it be wiser to take it as it is and help to improve it, or to reject it and disperse it? Can Louisiana be brought into proper practical relation with the Union sooner by sustaining or by discarding a new state government?" Lincoln also stated his view that, quote, "if universal amnesty is granted to the insurgents, I cannot see how I can avoid exacting in return universal suffrage, or at least suffrage on the basis of intelligence and military service." This was Lincoln's last public address. Reportedly, John Wilkes Booth was in the crowd, and on hearing the speech, Booth reportedly said to a friend nearby, quote, "That means citizenship. Now by God I'll put him through. That is the last speech he will ever make." Booth then made good on that promise 3 days later on April 14, 1865. As part of his re-election campaign, Lincoln had replaced his first-term vice president Hannibal Hamlin with a Southern senator by the name of Andrew Johnson. Johnson was the only member of the Senate from a state which had seceded to remain in the Senate. He did so despite himself being a slave owner and the former governor of a slave state of Tennessee. He attempted to convince Southern senators to remain with him, as they would have been a majority in the Senate had they done so, but he was unsuccessful. He then campaigned in his home state of Tennessee against leaving the Union, again failing and leading to death threats against him, and for him to be forced to eventually flee the state. In 1862, he was able to return when Lincoln appointed a military governor, and more of the state began to return to Union control. Lincoln seemed to be impressed with his performance there, and Lincoln reportedly wanted to replace Hamlin with a Democrat to balance the ticket and show his desire for reconciliation and bipartisanship, running under the National Union Party rather than the Republican Party. In addition to Andrew Johnson, Lincoln had reportedly considered others, including the previously discussed Benjamin Butler, to be his vice president. But after his nomination convention, Lincoln reportedly said, "Andy Johnson, I think, is a good man." Johnson came to Washington for Lincoln's inauguration on March 3, 1865, and reportedly attended a party in his honor, where he drank heavily and was hungover the following day at the inauguration. He reportedly asked the leaving Vice President Hamlin for some whiskey, took 2 long swigs, and said, quote, "I need all the strength for the occasion I can have." Soon after, Johnson gave a long, rambling speech. The incident was bad enough, and his drunken condition obvious enough to those who watched, that Lincoln reportedly felt he needed to respond to it, saying, quote, "I have known Andy Johnson for many years. He made a bad slip the other day, but you need not be scared. Andy ain't a drunkard." Still reportedly, the men did not meet again until almost a month later on April 14th, the same day Lincoln was assassinated. In May of 1865, Johnson issued a pardon for most Confederate soldiers willing to take an oath of allegiance. In Louisiana, this functionally meant that in the next election, most of the former Confederate soldiers were eligible to vote, but blacks were not. The results were illustrated in so-called black codes, passed in 1865. In St. Landry's Parish, the code included laws such as, "Be it ordained by the police and the jury of the parish of St. Landry's that no Negro should be allowed to pass within the limits of said parish without a special permit in writing from his employer." Also saying, "Be it further ordained that every Negro is required to be in the regular service of some white person, or former owner, who shall be held responsible for the conduct of said Negro." If the intent of these laws was not clear enough, the party platform of the Louisiana Southern Democrats made the goal explicit. It stated, quote, "Resolved that we hold this to be a government of white people, made and to be perpetuated for the exclusive political benefit of the white race, and in accordance with the constant adjudication of the United States Supreme Court, that the people of African descent cannot be considered as citizens of the United States, and that there can be no event, nor under any circumstances, be any equality between the white and other races." This was the party that overwhelmingly controlled the state legislature when elections were held in November of 1865. Governor Michael Hahn had moved on to the Senate. His appointed replacement, James Wells, was able to hold on to the seat by giving political favors and political appointments to former Confederates, while campaigning as a moderate alternative to their preferred choice, former Confederate Governor Henry Watkins Allen, who was not officially on the ballot as he remained in exile. But even in exile and off the ballot, Watkins won nearly 20% of the vote by write-in, including outright majorities in 5 districts. Some have argued Wells was allowed to win, as he was seen a placeholder, until Johnson issued more pardons. Throughout the South, the trend continued. Confederates who had lost on the battlefield were able to win in the ballot boxes because free slaves were either not legally permitted to vote or prevented from voting by violence. Congress attempted to pass a Civil Rights Act to address the matter, but were delayed by an Andrew Johnson veto, as well as his appointment of officials who sabotaged Reconstruction efforts and aided in restoring the pre-war Southern power structure by returning the confiscated lands and wealth to the same people who had called for secession in the first place. Many of the state and local elections had already been won by former Confederates, which restored them to control over the various mechanisms of the government in the South, meaning the damage was already done. Over Johnson's veto, Congress was able to finally pass the Civil Rights Act in 1866. The 14th Amendment passed soon after, going to the states for ratification, with the 5th Amendment coming soon behind, which would give full voting rights. But laws are just words without systems to enforce them. Governor Wells understood his best hope of staying in power and for his party to take power in other parts of the state would be if freed blacks were given the right to vote, which had been left out of the 1864 Constitutional Convention. But he also knew the new Louisiana state legislature wasn't inclined to speed up the process. He used a legal technicality to reopen the 1864 Constitutional Convention and to schedule a new convention meeting in New Orleans in 1866 on July 30th. However, in the recent elections, New Orleans had chosen its mayor, John T. Monroe, the mayor who had been removed by federal troops during the Civil War. At that time, reportedly, Monroe said, quote, "We yield to physical force alone and maintain our alliance to the government of the Confederate States." He was then imprisoned for a time during the war after protesting Butler's orders, and reportedly was placed in solitary confinement with a ball and chain for 6 months for refusing to take an oath of allegiance to the Union. While he was incarcerated, when his child became terminally ill, his wife asked for him to be able to release to see his son. Monroe was told he would be given permission if he provided the oath of allegiance. He once again refused, and his child died without him present. When he was released, he went to see the President of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, and moved to Mobile, Alabama, where he was arrested twice more by Union forces before the war ended. But Johnson's pardon allowed him to return and be placed on the ballot and be re-elected and restored as mayor in March of 1866. Monroe declared the new Constitutional Convention illegal. The sheriff over the city was a former Confederate war general, Harry T. Hayes, who had also been pardoned by Andrew Johnson, and had for some time been openly recruiting and deputizing former Confederate soldiers. Black residents and white supporters held a rally on July 27th in support of the upcoming convention, giving speeches about the importance of the convention and the right of free blacks to vote. They called for a march on July 30th, the first day of the convention, to take place, including marching bands to celebrate the event. The convention was set to be held at the Mechanics Institute in New Orleans, starting around noon. 27 delegates would be present, presided over by Judge Rufus K. Howell. Black Union veterans held a parade outside, but they were soon surrounded and outnumbered by white protesters. When the delegates took a break from the convention around 1:30 in the afternoon, a group of armed whites was waiting nearby. As shots rang out, the delegates and black marchers, the vast majority of whom were unarmed, were forced to retreat back into the Mechanics Institute. When Hayes and his deputies arrived, most accounts agree they aided the mob in the massacre of the black veterans. Secretary of War Edward Stanton stated in his report of the incident, quote, "Immediately after this riot assumed a serious character, the police, aided by the citizens, became the assailants, and from the evidence I am forced to believe exercised great brutality in making their arrests. Finally, they attacked the convention hall, and a protracted struggle ensued. The people inside the hall gave up some who surrendered, and were attacked afterwards and brutally treated." General Phil Sheridan's report on the event stated the marchers and the delegates were attacked, quote, "with firearms, clubs, and knives, in a manner so unnecessary and atrocious as to compel me to say it was murder. It was no riot. It was an absolute massacre by the police, which was not excelled in murderous cruelty by that of Fort Pillow. It was a murder which the mayor and the police of the city perpetrated without a shadow of necessity. In just 2 hours, at least 34 were killed, including 3 of the delegates. At least 119 were wounded, including 17 other delegates by the combined mob and police. Another 200 were arrested by local police who supported the massacre. Union forces arrived in early August and implemented martial law to take back control over the city. But this and similar events in Memphis moved Congress to speed up the process of adding protections for free blacks. Still, Johnson continued to be an impediment. As the Cleveland Daily Reader wrote of the Mechanics Institute massacre, quote, "Remember that this work was done by the constitutional authorities of the city of New Orleans, rebels in record and in heart, but placed in power over loyal men by the policy of a renegade president. Remember that these scenes are but a prelude to what is to be, if Mr. Johnson's policy shall be carried out." The 1866 midterms increased the number of congressional members who were in favor of reforms, and in 1867, a major Reconstruction Act passed Congress over Johnson's veto. Military governments were imposed in many areas in the South, and the voting rights of most former Confederate soldiers and officials were temporarily restricted by a law that required them to give a, quote, ironclad oath that they never supported the Confederacy in any way in order to be able to run for office. President Johnson continued to attempt to stop the implementation of Reconstruction, and as a result he was impeached, but a vote for his removal failed by 1 vote. Under military rule and following the new provisions, Louisiana was able to pass a state constitution in 1868 that allowed for them to be readmitted to the Union ahead of the 1868 presidential elections at a convention made up almost entirely pro-Union politicians, with 96 of the 98 delegates coming from the pro-Union party. Nearly half of the delegation was black. In addition to giving voting rights to freed black men, the Constitution called for integrated public schools and created protections for the property rights of married women. It included mandates for the state to care for the mentally ill and physically impaired citizens, and it eliminated restrictions requiring someone to own property to hold office and serve on juries. It also removed laws that allowed imprisonment for debt. The introduction of the Constitution read, quote, "Rebellion is disenfranchisement. We do not endorse the acts of the 39th and 40th Congress, and we will reconstruct Louisiana on the basis of the Reconstruction Bill. We are friendly to universal liberty, but no universal amnesty, but the continuance of disenfranchisement of all Congress and all others we may think necessary for the safety of our common country." As to if former Confederates should be able to vote in the future, the convention was mixed. Some called for the restriction only be applied to Confederate leadership, while others were less charitable. One delegate said those who opposed restriction could, quote, "leave the country and go to Venezuela or elsewhere." The Constitution passed, and soon after an election for governor was held. A 26-year-old by the name of Henry C. Warmoth was elected governor of Louisiana, defeating the radical Republican candidate James G. Taliaferro a former judge who had been the president of the Constitutional Convention. But this was an election where Union General Philip Sheridan reported nearly half of the white male population could not vote because of the restrictions on who had supported the Confederacy. Warmoth almost immediately disappointed his black supporters by vetoing legislation which would penalize owners of public places who refused to provide equal service to blacks and whites, and signed a weaker bill with little enforcement power. Andrew Johnson was not nominated for re-election in 1868. The race was between Union General Ulysses S. Grant and Horatio Seymour. Seymour ran on a campaign slogan of, quote, "This is a white man's country. Let white men rule." Seymour's vice presidential candidate, Francis Preston Blair, was even more explicit. He said in speeches that a vote for Grant was a vote for, quote, "a semi-barbarous race of blacks who are worshippers of fetishists and polygamists, which would, quote, subject the white woman to their unbridled lust." Throughout the South, groups like the Ku Klux Klan and the Knights of White Camellia used violence and fraud to suppress the black vote. In St. Landry's Parish, in the town of Opelousas, a white teacher by the name of Emerson Bentley was working as an editor for the St. Landry's Progress, while also teaching at a black school in the city. When he walked into his classroom in early September, he found a note that read, "E.B. Beware, KKK." The 18-year-old Bentley ignored the warning and continued to publish critical articles. On September 28th, 3 members of the local chapter of the Knights of the White Camellia came into his classroom while he was teaching, and beat and whipped him in front of his students. Bentley's students fled the classroom shouting, "They're killing Mr. Bentley." Bentley was able to escape to New Orleans, but rumors spread that he had been killed. Hearing this, local supporters of Bentley began to protest what they believed was his murder. But at the time, it was estimated that the Knights of the White Camellia had around 3,000 members in the parish, which was roughly 21% of the total population. 29 people who were protesting what happened to Bentley were taken to the local prison. 27 of them were then executed. Another editor of the St. Landry's Progress, named C.E. Durand, was murdered. His body was displayed openly outside the Opelousas drugstore. Over the next 2 weeks, black families were hunted by the Knights of the White Camellia, often being killed in their homes, leading to an estimated 250 deaths. With all of the pro-union papers in the area burned, the only local reports of the event were in support of it. An article in the Democratic Franklin Planters Banner wrote, quote, "The people are generally well satisfied with the results of the St. Landry's riot. Only they regret the carpetbaggers escaped." The article went on to say, quote, "The editor escaped, and 100 dead Negroes, perhaps 100 more wounded and crippled. A dead white radical, a dead Democrat, and 3 or 4 wounded Democrats are the upshot of the business." Just a few weeks later, the 1968 presidential election was held. Not a single vote for Grant was recorded. An election observer reportedly said they were, quote, "fully convinced that no man on that day could have voted any other than the Democratic ticket and not been killed inside of 24 hours thereafter." Louisiana Lieutenant Governor Oscar Dunn, a black man, later testified to Congress that he heard gunshots at his home nightly, which kept he and his family awake, and he stopped going to some places at night as he had, quote, "heard threats as I passed that they would put the Negro governor out of the way." Even he decided it was unsafe to vote because of these threats. Grant lost Louisiana, but was able to win the presidency. But before Grant could take office, on Christmas Day in 1868, the now lame duck President Johnson issued unconditional pardons and amnesty to nearly all former Confederates. This restored full legal rights, including voting rights and the ability to run for office, to nearly all the former Confederate soldiers in leadership. Once in office, Grant and the new Congress worked to pass laws to stop the various paramilitary groups in the South, creating the Department of Justice largely to address these specific concerns in 1870. In 1871, a civil rights law written by Benjamin Butler allowed for the temporary suspension of habeas corpus to protect civil rights. It became known as the Ku Klux Klan Act. These laws led to the arrest of hundreds of Klan members, forcing the organization to become more covert in their operations, often changing their names as the Klan itself had been designated as an illegal organization. In Louisiana, Governor Warmoth had begun reaching out to former Confederate voters as Johnson's pardon had restored their rights, fracturing the opposition and leading to chaos within his own party. Warmoth, using his office to engage in fraud and patronage to secure political power, led to his own party to call for his impeachment and replace him by the lieutenant governor, Oscar Dunn. But Dunn died unexpectedly, breaking the alliance to impeach Warmoth and making it much more politically complicated. Those attempting to impeach Warmoth were prevented from having a vote at the State House itself, so they sought to hold the impeachment at a legislative session outside of the State House at a saloon in the French Quarter. The leader of this group sent deputies to bring members of the legislature to the saloon to have a quorum to vote, but when attempting to do so, one of the deputies shot and killed one of the legislators. Warmoth used this event to have the legislators arrested, while at the same time replacing Dunn with one of Dunn's rivals, a man by the name of Pinckney Benton Stewart Pinchback. This removed the risk of impeachment, but all but removed any possibility he might be renominated for re-election by his party. As a result, he switched to the Liberal Republican Party, which opposed Grant's re-election and endorsed Grant's opponent, Horace Greeley. At this point, even the lieutenant governor he selected, Pinchback, called for his removal. Shortly before this, in 1869, Grant Parish was formed in Louisiana. It was one of a number of Reconstruction parishes that were created as the state was redivided by the new state Congress. Grant Parish was named after newly elected Ulysses S. Grant, and the new county seat of Colfax after his vice president, Schuyler Colfax. Before the parish had been created, during the 1968 election, a major plantation owner by the name of William Smith Calhoun had recently inherited a 14,000-acre plantation. Calhoun's common-law wife was of mixed race, and he became a supporter of political black equity. But the ballot box was kept in the store of a man who had threatened to whip anyone who came to the store to vote for Grant. Calhoun had a ballot box moved, and personally oversaw the submission of over 150 votes from the freedmen working on his plantation. However, a group of whites threw the ballot box into the river, arresting Calhoun and murdering a black election official by the name of Hal Frazier. After he was released, Calhoun campaigned to create the new district to assure a black majority parish, seeing that the election prior had been stolen. And so the first presidential election for the new parish would occur in 1872. And the governor's race was held in the same year. Warmoth would not be on the ballot, but he continued to attempt political maneuvering. The primary candidates on the ballot were William Kellogg and John McHenry. McHenry was a former Confederate officer and was endorsed by Warmoth, both because he was now allying himself with groups opposed to Reconstruction and likely in exchange for a promise that he would be made senator should McHenry win. All agree that the election that followed was full of corruption and violence, some of which came from Warmoth's direction to aid McHenry. The state elections board divided into two. One backed Warmoth, one backed the legislature. Warmoth, from the position of governor, said McHenry had won. The legislature indicated Kellogg had won. Warmoth was impeached for his involvement in all of this, with just 35 days left in his term. This made Pinchback the first black governor of Louisiana. But it wasn't just over the governor's race. These elections also included how the state house played out, even going down to local sheriff elections. Both candidates declared victory, and both held inauguration ceremonies and certified lists of local officials. Kellogg and his supporters tried to bypass state courts to appeal directly to federal courts. McHenry supporters tried to seize a state arsenal. Both of these moves were highly controversial and at least initially unsuccessful. In Colfax County, blacks were afraid that white militias would try to take control of the courthouse as they had in the previous election. So armed black militias began digging trenches around the building and setting up defensive positions to protect it. The office holders they believed won stayed there with them for weeks as they felt unsafe in their homes from the white militia groups. As tensions escalated and a black man named Jesse McKinney was shot and killed, women and children also began to stay at the courthouse for safety. On Easter Sunday, April 13th, 1873, between 150 and 300 white men armed with rifles, most on horseback, brought a cannon to the courthouse and announced they intended to attack. They gave women and children 30 minutes to leave. Once the 30 minutes had passed, the cannon was fired and a battle ensued for several hours. But in the end, the black forces were outgunned and the courthouse was on fire. When the cannon was being repositioned, some began to flee to the nearby woods, only to be run down by white militia forces on horseback. Those who remained at the courthouse were forced to raise the white flag of surrender. In the confusion, as the white militia approached, possibly to accept the surrender, a shot rang out, and one white militiaman was killed. There is a great deal of debate as to who actually fired the bullet and whether it was intentional or accidental, or possibly even came from the white militia. But regardless, once the shot was fired, what all accounts agree on is that the blacks who had put down their weapons were now defenseless, and then they were massacred. Numbers of dead ranged from 60 to 150 depending on the account. As the evening came, even those who were taken prisoner were murdered. Only one prisoner survived, Levi Nelson, who had been shot by Bill Cruikshank, but managed to crawl away without being noticed. On May 22, 1873, following a ruling by the federal courts, Grant declared Kellogg was the governor. But Kellogg's appointment continued to be contested by McHenry and white paramilitary forces that supported him. In August of 1874, members of a group known as the White League, a group that was linked to the events at Colfax Courthouse, went on a kidnapping and murder spree of government officials and free blacks in the Red River Parish. They forced the office holders to sign oaths to leave Louisiana, but even after signing and attempting to leave, 6 were murdered as they left. A black man by the name of Levin Allen had his arms and legs broken and was burned alive as a warning against black resistance movements. Less than a month later, on September 14, 1874, thousands of armed members of the White League came to New Orleans, overwhelming local police and state militia. They forced the governor to take refuge as the group controlled the city for several days until federal troops finally arrived in an event that came to be known as the Battle of Liberty Place. Kellogg struggled to serve out the remainder of his term, but it was clear his control over the state was limited, and groups like the White League were able to act largely with impunity absent federal assistance. State and federal officials attempted to prosecute those involved in the Colfax Massacre. 97 people were arrested, but only 3 men were able to be convicted under federal laws that had been specifically designed to stop the violence of the Ku Klux Klan. One of these 3 men was Bill Cruikshank, who, along with his co-defendants, appealed the conviction to the Supreme Court. Once the case got to the Supreme Court overturned the convictions, indicating only state courts had jurisdictions, writing an opinion that stated, quote, "The government of the United States, although it is, within the scope of its powers, supreme and beyond the states, can neither grant nor secure its citizens rights or privileges which are not expressly or by implication placed under its jurisdiction. All that cannot be so granted or secured are left to the exclusive protection of the states." One of the arguments made was that the disarming of the black militia took away their rights to wear arms. The court stated, quote, "The right there that is specified of bearing arms for a lawful purpose. This is not a right granted by the Constitution. Neither is it in any manner dependent upon the instrument for its existence. The Second Amendment declares that it shall not be infringed, but this, as has been seen, means no more than it shall not be infringed by Congress." In 1891, the city of New Orleans erected a monument to, quote, "commemorate the uprising of 1874 at the foot of Canal Street." Reportedly, those who wished to erect the monument were having difficulty finding funding, but after 11 Italians were lynched in an event known as the Hennessy Affair, fundraising improved. In 1932, the following inscription was added, quote, "McHenry and Penn, having been elected governor and lieutenant governor by the white people, were duly installed by this overthrow of carpetbag government, ousting the usurpers, Governor Kellogg, white, and Lieutenant Governor Antoine, colored. United States troops took over the state government and reinstated the usurpers, but the national election of November 1876 recognized white supremacy in the South and gave us our state." In 1993, the monument was moved to a less prominent location, but still remained. It was not fully removed until 2017. History is awkward.